because he was our teacher, and he taught us so many things. He taught us about U.S. history in a way that I wasn't taught in high school or in college, but a couple generations behind me were because of Howard Zinn, because of a people's history of the United States. What did he teach us about U.S. history? He taught us that it was a history of class conflict. He didn't focus on presidents. He didn't focus on generals. He didn't focus on wars. He focused on the people at the bottom, the people who were being oppressed. Native Americans who were victims of near total genocide. African Americans who came here as slaves. Women who didn't have the right to vote. Workers who didn't have the right to organize. These were the people that Howard Zinn focused on. And he didn't focus just on them as victims, but them as actors. Them as people who would demand their rights. And so he was an excavator. He was an archaeologist. He used the historian's brush to find these stories that we weren't told. And in finding them, to give us a new sense about what this country is about and about how we bring about social change. As Phil said, he taught us that social change happens and comes from below. But that's not all he taught us. He taught us a lot of other things. He taught us about war. He taught us that no war is justified. He taught us that you could have a just cause for a war, but to take that as an excuse to go to war was an immoral thing to do, and that the victims of war are overwhelmingly civilians. And he also talked about the soldiers who go to war. The soldiers go to war not for their country, but they go to war because of politicians who dupe them into giving up their lives or conscript them into giving up their lives. And they go to war for the corporations who profit from the war. All of that he taught us. He also taught us about the culture of resistance. Howard Zinn had an expansive view of how social change happens. And he also was a great appreciator of art, of culture. His wife Roz, who preceded him in death by about a year and a half, was a painter. Howard Zinn himself was a playwright. And he loved and exalted the poet and the writer and the artist and the actor. He understood that these people, with their art, could reach hundreds of thousands of people who aren't reached by what he called the dull oratory of politics. So he taught us that too. And he also taught us how to be a human being on the left, and just how to be a decent human being. I've had the pleasure over the last couple hours from about 4 to 6 this afternoon going through some of his back columns in the Progressive because we're putting together a remembrance. And I came across a little passage that he wrote in memory of Eugene Victor Debs. And the title was Eugene V. Debs and the Idea of Socialism. Howard Zinn, as you may have heard from the clips as you were coming in, was never afraid to call himself a socialist. He upheld the ideals of democratic socialism. But here's what he said about Eugene V. Debs. And I got to take my glasses off. We are always in need of radicals who are also lovable. Debs was what every socialist or anarchist or radical should be. Fierce in his convictions, kind and compassionate in his personal relations. That's who Howard Zinn was. Lovable, lovely, endearing, a man of great dignity, a man of amazing humility, actually. You know, I've known people, and I'm sure you have too, with 1/100th of the fame of Howard Zinn, 1/100th of the accomplishments of Howard Zinn, who had an ego 100 times as big as Howard Zinn. And he didn't lord it over people. He treated everybody with decency and with grace, and he had a terrific sense of humor that my colleague Liz DiNovella recollected in her fine remembrance of him. And that sense of humor didn't always come through in his writings, but it really came through when you saw him in person. When you saw him speak at the Orpheum, or if you saw him speak at the Union Theater, or if you saw him speak at the Progressive's 100th anniversary this spring. He had a self-deprecating, very wry sense of humor. And he also had a fierceness. This fierceness he talked about with Debs, he himself had that fierceness. And he had almost a tick in the way that he spoke, because he would remember what the conventional wisdom was, or what the apology was for some horrendous policy. And then he would simply say one word, no. He would just stop in the middle of the sentence and say no. And that negation was itself an empowering thing. So we are in mourning this week for Howard Zinn, of course. But, you know, he lives on in all his writings. He lives on in the People's History of the United States. He lives on in The People Speak, this great thing he did for the History Channel. And he lives on in all of us. So we say of Howard Zinn, presente. The last thing Howard Zinn wrote was for The Nation in a couple paragraphs in a compendium of observations that they gathered from leftist intellectuals around the country about the very topic we're talking about tonight, Obama. And Howard Zinn concluded that Obama is turning into a mediocre president. And I think that is the proper assessment. And I also think, and we talked about this last year at this time, that there was an act of self-delusion on the part of many of us during the campaign that brought Barack Obama to power. That we convinced ourselves or prayed or hoped or dreamt that he was some kind of mythical composite of Martin Luther King Jr. and FDR. And that was always a long, long bet. You know, I like to play poker, and that just did not seem like a likely outcome. It always seemed more likely that he was going to be a composite of Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, who we praised on the campaign trail, and that's who he's really turned out to be, with a little bit of George W. Bush thrown in for bad measure and maybe a little Jimmy Carter for good. But he is not, you know, this legendary figure that a lot of people thought he was. And Norm talked about the promises he didn't keep. He did keep some promises. He told us he was going to take troops from Iraq and send them to Afghanistan. He told us he was going to escalate the war in Afghanistan, and he's escalated the war in Afghanistan. And so I think we need to get over the illusion that a lot of people had during the Clinton campaign, too, when Bill Clinton was running the first time, that he's talking right and it's a feint, because as soon as he gets in power, he's going to govern left. That didn't happen with Clinton, and it hasn't happened with Obama. You know, Obama talked on the campaign trail of the fierce urgency of now. It seems like the fierce urgency of yesterday. Maybe it was the fierce urgency to get elected. He did